A midnight visitor in a cabin in the woods. This is a true story. Every time I tell it, it pulls the eyes of everyone in the room. I'm not sure why I haven't posted it before, but upon reflecting with a friend, I decided it was time to share. In the summer of 2020, my friends, Alex and Violet, and I decided to go on a mountain vacation. COVID cabin fever had hit us hard and we were desperate to get out. We settled on a mountain estate and planned to camp and hike at several different locations. For one night we thought it would be fun to book a cabin in the woods. Violet's parents had rented a fire tower once and loved it, but a cabin beside a fire tower was all we could find. It was cheap, clean, and secluded. Excited to have a night where we could be as obnoxious as we wanted, we booked it. In the weeks leading up to the trip, we decided it would be a great idea to drop acid at the cabin. Violet bought an entire sheet in preparation for our arrival, and it was tucked in her bag as we pulled out of the driveway to make our way to the cabin. I remember this knot in the pit of my stomach, this aching feeling that gnawed at me. I told Alex and Violet that there was no way we could drop acid that night. Violet was pissed. We turned around and got into a massive argument, but I stood my ground. I just knew that we had no business tripping that night. Finally, the fireworks settled and we were off. The cabin was roughly 30 minutes away from the nearest town. It sat atop a mountain. We held our breath as we rounded the busted road that spiraled toward the top. There were no pull-offs, no other campsites. Just a long, winding road that led us to the cabin at the peak. We settled in and started a fire to keep warm. As dusk gave way to night, we heard the unmistakable noise of an engine on the road, then the flash of headlights. A side-by-side with 3 kids arrived and our nerves settled. They smiled, gave us a wave, climbed the fire tower, and left. We'd heard there may be occasional visitors to the fire tower, but they were the only ones who'd come by. We doused the fire and moved inside, heated some hot dogs until they were lukewarm, ate them fast, and sat in the silence. You don't know how quiet it is until you're in the middle of nowhere. You can hear every rustle of the leaves, the whisper of the wind through their branches. You get so used to white noise. Living in the city, there's always the hum of an air conditioner or the dim roar of traffic to focus on. Here, the closest thing to white noise was the sound of our own breathing. We jumped at every noise, too frightened to speak to one another, and finally, I'd had enough. I cracked a few wine coolers, passed them to Alex and Violet, and slapped a board game down on the table between our bunk beds. It didn't take long for us to loosen, and we were laughing, having the raucous good time we'd envisioned. Much soberer than we'd thought, but enough that we were able to ignore the rumble of the woods. Later, we'd all recall hearing noises in the background. The snap of a twig. The dim rumble of an engine. None of us wanted to rupture the air of nonchalance between us, so we ignored it, until a human hand reached up to the window between us and slapped it 3 times. We were screaming in an instant. Alex called 911, put them on speakerphone, and handed his cell to me. He grabbed pokers from the fireplace and passed them out. Violet started calling family members and saying her last goodbyes. I held my breath and listened for any more noise. Whoever this was, whatever this was, would have heard us call 911, and now they were being careful to make a silent retreat. Dispatch arrived 20 minutes later, a lucky thing for a 1 a.m. emergency call, and had their dogs comb the mountain. Nothing. They suggested it may have been a bear, but I could tell from their faces that they didn't believe that for a second. We'd barely cooked those hot dogs, and why would a bear smack the window by a couple of screaming kids rather than the one closest to the pan we'd used to cook? Why would a bear knock on the window like a human? Why, when we screamed, did the bear make a stealthy retreat? They had no answers, but they had one anecdote. As they'd sped to us, they'd come across a car at the base of the mountain. But that was the only sign of life they'd seen. I remember my blood ran cold, but Violet and Alex were too frazzled to absorb the weight of what they'd said, and dizzied by a new horror. Violet's car, thoroughly dusted by her drive up the mountain, was covered in handprints. Handprints that didn't match ours, that touched places we hadn't. We grabbed our shit by the armful and threw it inside, eager to remove every part of ourselves from this mountain. We followed the police, grateful every pothole found us further and further from that wretched cabin. We made it down in record time and found lodging at a seedy hotel that reeked of cat piss. I couldn't sleep. The thought of that car on the road rang in my head. Remember, there was nothing else on that mountain. It was a narrow road to the top, no pull-offs, no other campsites. There was the fire tower. Maybe a visitor decided to spook us during their late-night excursion. But the kids from earlier. We'd seen their headlights. Whoever did this had stopped their vehicle further down the road and hiked the rest of the way. They didn't want to be spotted. They wanted silence, secrecy. Whoever this was hadn't been looking for a cheap scare. They'd planned this. I don't think I'll ever know what the person on the mountain wanted from me. I don't know if it was a practical joke or the beginning of a night of terror. I'm grateful for Alex's quick wit in calling 911. I wonder if our visitor knew we had service. It had certainly been a welcome surprise to us. Perhaps that was a wrench in his plan, enough to spook him before he could make things ugly. In truth, I don't know if I want to know. I think I'm just content to say midnight stranger, let's not meet. Gotta love Grindr. I think a guy wanted to murder me in a cabin and I almost let him. Long. I posted this as a comment in another post/sub and another user suggested I share it here, so why not? So I've been on Grindr for about 10 years, 5 of which were illegal, not proud of it, and have had plenty of fucked up experiences. This one in particular reminds me of when I was at a party without my car. I was 19 in college, and my phone was on 10%, but a decently hot Grindr guy said he could pick me up and we could hang at his place before he drove me home, so of course I jumped on the opportunity. Anyway, we got to his place and he got me pretty drunk, not unusual for me, but never tried to make a move. I assumed he was gonna wait and just convince me to stay the night later. Finally my phone died after like 2 hours, the last 1% lives a lot longer than the rest lol, and I didn't even have to say anything before he noticed it was dead. Then he stood up and was like, well, let's go to the car then. When I asked if he had a charger I could use, he just said no. After we got in the car he got kinda quiet and less flirty and I spaced out just enjoying his music and looking out the window. I didn't even notice that he never asked where I lived until I realized we'd been driving for over an hour, not even towards my town, but into the canyons, Greater Salt Lake City, Utah area, and I asked where he was going and he just said thought we could go for a drive and my drunkest was like, oh. Okay. Smiley face. So anyway, to make a long story shorter, he ended up taking us 4 or 5 miles, I think, down a dirt road with no signs or houses until it dead-ended into this cabin with no lights on or cars outside, and he parked and turned the car off. That's when the dread started to creep in as I sobered up. I said I drank too much and should probably head home, but he didn't even respond. He just sat there staring at the cabin. Then he was like, you said you like being kinky. You're pretty submissive. Correct? And I was like, sure, but I just meant like normal rough kinda shit. Nothing wild, and he started sounding a little annoyed and his sentences seemed a little less carefully worded, like he was just spitting out the bare minimum of each thought. He said something about how some of his favorite people are those who can find pleasure in pain, and like if someone goes into shock enough times eventually it becomes like a drug and they crave more. Then something about how pushing a person into the deep end is the fastest way to teach them to swim. At that point I was scared enough to assert myself and said firmly, okay, well that sounds fun but just not tonight. I just want to go home now, this place is creepy. And he just sighed and gripped his keys tighter. Then right as I glanced at his phone sitting in the cup holder, right before it occurred to me to grab it, he snatched it up so fast and held it in his left hand kind of behind his head to make it clear he wasn't gonna let me near it. I made this kinda whoa sound and he just gave me this almost I'm proud of you son half smile like dads do when they pat your shoulder or something. So anyway, to make a long story shorter, he ended up taking us 4 or 5 miles, I think, down a dirt road with no signs or houses until it dead-ended into this cabin with no lights on or cars outside, and he parked and turned the car off. That's when the dread started to creep in as I sobered up. I said I drank too much and should probably head home, but he didn't even respond. He just sat there staring at the cabin. Then he was like, you said you like being kinky. You're pretty submissive. Correct? And I was like, sure, but I just meant like normal. It was quiet and he kept looking me up and down for a minute or so, and then got a little more gruff and said, let's go inside. I have these friends you'll really like. Once you meet them, you'll feel a lot better. Or something to that extent, but he wasn't even trying to sound genuine or comforting like he'd been doing so well earlier in the night. Finally I lied and spoke up a bit and told him I told my roommates and my friend I was meeting up with you before you picked me up. I sent screenshots of your face and some of the convo. They're gonna freak out if I don't charge my phone and reply to them in the next few hours. I tried not to make it sound accusatory, but more like I was just worried about my friends going crazy, but it was clear he knew what I was implying. At that point he let out an exasperated grunty sigh and started the car and drove away, kept the headlights off all the way back down the dirt road for some reason. Driving back I got nervous about him stalking me and coming after me in the future, so I tried to apologize and tell him I'd be down to hang out another time maybe, but tonight just wasn't great for me, blah blah blah. He didn't say a single word the whole drive back. and didn't ask where I lived. I didn't intend to tell him either, but dropped me off at a McDonald's about 40 miles from my apartment, and when I was stepping out of the car he suddenly leaned over and gave me a hard shove. So I almost fell out the rest of the way, and he grabbed my backpack off the floor and flung it out his window across the parking lot and peeled out with the passenger door still open, broke my laptop and cracked my phone, and I had to ask a stranger to use her charger and call an Uber, but at that point I was just so anxious to get home I didn't give a shit. What's so weird is how, while it was happening, even though I was terrified, I guess I wasn't thinking about exactly what he was planning to do with me. I just knew I needed to get away. So it wasn't until I got home and got in the shower that I realized how fucked it all was and what might have happened if I'd let him walk me into the cabin and all that stuff. I remember just being so shaken and smacked by the reality of it. Almost felt like a panic attack, so I sat down in the shower with my head between my knees and cried till it ran cold, and I got out and woke my roommate up to tell him about it, and he kinda calmed me down. So while I still have a Grindr account, I really just use it as an ego boost. I'm reluctant to meet up with anyone from it now, haha. Anyway, girls and gays, I suppose the moral of the story is we gotta be goddamn careful out there. Last cabin on the right. This past New Year's was mine and my boyfriend's 4-year anniversary. We typically don't do much, so this year we decided to make it special by planning a romantic getaway. At the time, the two of us were living in Seattle and wanted to rent a cabin in a snowy small town for the weekend. We found a cabin on Airbnb with a hot tub and we were sold. The cabin was, of course, the last house on the road. To get to it, you had to drive down a small removed, private road that ended in a roundabout. Off the roundabout was a long uphill driveway leading up to our cabin. We got to the cabin and it was snowy and beautiful. The cabin itself sat on top of a garage and you needed to take stairs on the backside of the property to get to the front door. When we got inside, there was a booklet with all of the cabin's info outlined. The book said that during the snowy season, don't be surprised if their contracted snowplowers showed up to clear off the driveway. Okay, sounds good. We unpacked and realized that there was no service on either of our phones, but the booklet told us there was a landline in the cabin if we needed anything. We spent the first night by the fire playing board games and drinking wine. The weekend was exactly what we needed. We planned to spend the next day in town, and that night, I had booked us a reservation for a nice dinner. We were gone almost all day, only returning briefly to get dressed up to enjoy some good food. Dinner was great and we were excited to head back to the cabin for some champagne hot tubbing. While at dinner, the temperature had dropped and it snowed for the first time that day, coating everything in a fresh layer of powder. We drove down the private road and got to the driveway. At that point my boyfriend stopped the car, headlights shining in front, and asked if I noticed the new tire tracks. I looked at the driveway, hoping to quickly disregard the new tire tracks, but there they were. Immediately, we remembered that the snowplowers could have stopped by. But the issue was we saw the tire tracks because of the snow, and who plows in the dark? We also knew that once we were at the cabin we had no service on our cell phones, so we figured we would head back into town and message our Airbnb hosts and ask if them or one of their friends had stopped by the apartments. We waited for a while in town for a reply from our hosts but didn't hear back. We could have called, but at that point it was past 10 and we didn't want to be bad guests. We figured we blew the whole thing out of proportion and might as well head back to the cabin. After all, I am big into true crime, spooky subreddits, and horror movies, so I was probably just psyching myself out. My boyfriend drove us back, and this time we actually drove up the driveway. Towards the top of the hill part of the driveway I noticed something. My stomach dropped as I noticed footprints on the property. We backed down the driveway and took a closer look to see if there were more footprints. From what it looked like, someone had drove up the driveway, reversed down, parked, and then got out of the car and walked onto the property. Since we had now also driven on the tracks, we couldn't find where the footprints ended. The property was quite large with tons of trees and brush, and we knew that these footprints could go anywhere. The moment we saw footprints we decided to call the police. We figured it was better safe than sorry. We would just have the officer go onto the property with us to check everything out. We drove down the road till we got service, called the police and waited for their arrival. The policeman showed up and we followed him onto the property. The police officer scanned the property and determined there was no one out there. Obviously, we are a little shaken up and a lot embarrassed. We thanked the officer as he left. Needless to say, neither of us wanted to sit in the hot tub in the dark woods after what had happened. Instead, we locked the doors and watched a movie, champagne less. We were both tired from the day and passed out pretty quickly, At 3 a.m., we both woke up on the couch with the TV on and all the lights, laughing about how the night didn't turn out as planned. As my boyfriend went to brush his teeth, we heard a noise. It sounded mechanical and only lasted a few seconds. We looked at each other and froze. The garage door. There are very few reasons that someone would need to open the garage door of a guest-occupied Airbnb at 3 in the morning. Like I said, we woke up to all of our lights on and the cabin had lots of windows. We knew that if someone was outside, they knew we were there, and they could see us. I immediately grabbed the landline and dialed 911. We sat crouched in the Airbnb, praying for the police to arrive. We knew that whoever had made those tracks was still on the property and this time they were making noise. As I sat talking to the operator, we heard a bang in our balcony as if someone threw something up onto it. I was losing my absolute shit when the operator told me the police were nearby. All of a sudden, they were there. We saw the police lights and watched them search the property. Soon we heard banging on the door. It was the police. We were okay. At the door were two policemen, one in front of us and one a little behind, kind of kicking around snow and looking at the ground. I immediately noticed the police officer in the back as the officer that did the initial check on the property. The police officer told us that not only was the garage door shut, but it was locked. And again, there was no signs of someone on the property. We discussed leaving, but the police officer said the road conditions were too dangerous the time of night. I looked at the police officer who had to come out to the property twice and felt I had deeply disappointed him. My boyfriend and I went back inside, again locking all the doors, and tried to sleep. The next day we were leaving, and while we survived the night, I didn't feel right in the cabin anymore. It was forever the spooky cabin in my head and I wanted to leave. As we packed, we heard the same noise we heard at 3 a.m. Oh, it was the heater. A heater that sounds just like a garage. The sound lasts the same duration. My boyfriend looked at me and immediately said, "You need to give up your murder shows," and walked away. As for the banging on the balcony, it was just the perfectly timed fall of a pine cone. Smiley face. I promise I'm not paranoid. I think back on this story a lot and am embarrassed about how little came of it, but I'm also incredibly grateful for the same reason. But, whoever drove onto the property and walked around, thank you for triggering all of my nightmares. Please stay home, and oh yeah, let's not meet. Cabin man. It was about late November in Colorado and I was about 7 or 8, and my father got the idea of taking us all for a weekend to a cabin that he was going to rent. My mother thought it was a great idea for me, my sister, my father, and my mother to bond. So, that's exactly what happened. We rented a cabin for a few days. We took off school on Friday to get a head start on getting there, which I had no issue with. We got there and it was sure cold. Well, it was almost December, so I guess it made sense that it was so cold. Anyway, we got all set up and decided where we'd all sleep. We ate dinner, and then we all got set up for bed and were thinking about what we'd do tomorrow. We got there kind of late, so we couldn't do much on the first day. That night though, I heard noises outside. It sounded kind of like footsteps. I looked out the window and saw nothing, so I figured it must have been an animal. I tried to go back to sleep, then about 15 minutes later I heard it again. I woke my sister up, which she was about 11 at the time. And she heard it as well. We both walked over to the window and saw something out there. We weren't quite sure what it was. We decided it'd best for it not to see us, so we went back to sleep. I had a hard time sleeping that night, and so did my sister. But when we eventually woke up, my mother was inside making breakfast and my father was outside. I asked my mom if I could go outside with my dad, and she told me sure, while my sister stayed inside and waited for my mother to finish breakfast. I walked outside and my father was talking to some man. A short, chubby man. He had a shaved head and was wearing a veteran cap. He looked really nervous too, for some reason. He was sweating a lot as well, even though it was freezing outside. I walked over to him and my father looked at me and said, "Oh, this is my son," and told him my name. The man looked at me and said, "Nice to meet you, kid. My name's Patrick." He smiled and looked at me. I smiled and greeted him back, and it may have been rude at the time, but I was just a kid, and asked him, "You look kinda scared. Are you all right?" And he kind of coughed and replied with, "Yeah, I'm fine, just went through shell shock. I'm a veteran," he said, as I couldn't tell already with the cap he was wearing. He seemed normal then. My father seemed to really like this guy, and I liked him at first too. He told my father he had also rented a cabin with his family and that they were really close to us, so he decided to introduce himself. My father invited him inside for breakfast and he stayed, and it was normal. I went outside to play after that with my father and Patrick. While outside, I fell and scraped my knee and started crying. My father was inside at the time, a bad time for him to be inside. My mother was calling for him and he ran inside while I was out there with Patrick. Patrick ran over to me and told me to come with him to his cabin because he had band-aids. I agreed and went with him. I wasn't a very smart kid. I went with Patrick. We talked about what I liked doing and I told him about video games that I played and stuff like that. Then things got weird. He asked me what shoe size I was and how old I am. I didn't know what my shoe size is, I told him, but I told him my age. He just kind of chuckled and said something along the lines of, good to know. Also, his cabin was nowhere near ours. It was way back. It took about 20 to 25 minutes to walk there. I was tired and there was no point in getting the band-aid anymore. But I still decided to keep going since I had walked so long. We entered the cabin. He told me to go in first, so I did. As soon as I walked in, I realized something. There was nobody in there. No family. I asked him where his family was, and he didn't answer, pretending like he didn't hear. He locked the door. I then got kind of frightened. He told me, I'll be right back with the band-aid, kiddo. He walked into the kitchen and pulled one out of somewhere, and then walked back and told me to have a seat and he'd put it on. I sat down and he put it on me. He also held my leg with his other hand and rubbed up and down it and told me, you're rather muscular. Kid. I like that. I kind of got scared and immediately stood up. He asked me what was wrong and I told him nothing and that my leg was feeling much better. I then thought my parents must be worried sick about me and that I should hurry back. He insisted that I stayed a little longer and ate there. I didn't want to, but I was alone and if I ran I don't think I could find my way back to my cabin. The door was locked too, so I just agreed and decided to eat with him and get it over with fast. He asked me how much I weighed, and I guessed around 73 pounds. He then had a smile go across his face. He nodded and said, perfect weight. I asked him perfect weight for what and he just kept smiling. I was really weirded out and asked him if I could go. He told me no and that things were just getting started and I shouldn't miss out on the fun. He had such a weird tone when he said that too. I then heard a big bang come from the bedroom. It was a closed door. Patrick stood up and looked kinda angry. He walked into the room and shut the door behind him. I then heard him yelling, did I fucking tell you that you could move? No, stay the fuck where you are. I have fucking company, or something like that. He then walked out with a smile on his face, and shut the door slowly. Sorry about that, it was just my wife. She's really sick and not allowed to be near visitors today. He was smiling while saying that. I wanted to go. I then looked around the room and noticed there were clothes everywhere, and it was really messy. He must have been living out of here. At that moment, his wife walked out of the room. I'm hungry, she said. He looked pissed. Get back in there, he said. His wife was extremely pale and looked like she had been crying a lot. She was sniffing and had red circles around her eyes. She looked at me, then walked back in the room. I asked him where his kids were. He didn't answer. He told me he had kids' clothes that he wanted me to try on. That was the last straw. I had to get out of that situation and I didn't know how. I started crying and then he hugged me. He told me, it'll be okay, little one, nothing is going to happen. Just try on these clothes. He walked in the back room. I thought that was the perfect time for me to leave. I unlocked his door and tried to leave as quietly as I could. I didn't care if I got lost anymore. I didn't want to take any more chances with Patrick. If that even was his name. I had a feeling he had been lying. He lied about having kids, so who knows what else. I was in the woods trying to find my way back. I was still close to his house, close enough to hear shouting. I heard him yelling stuff to his wife. Things along the lines of, where the fuck did he go, and, I knew I shouldn't have left him alone, you probably let him leave. I could have sworn I heard him call her whore and bitch a couple times. Then it happened. I stopped in my tracks. I heard footsteps. I went and hid behind a tree and looked in his direction. He was outside, and seemed to be looking for me. I was far enough away to where I could barely see him, but I could tell he was looking for something. He then stepped out in the forest and heard him shouting, "Hey kid, it's okay. You can come back now. You don't have to try on the clothes, and I have toys back in my cabin, all you have to do is come back." I then ran. I ran as fast as I could in a straight line in hopes to find somebody in my family. I was running away and I thought I heard shouting, but I didn't stop to hear it. Then after about an hour of running, I saw a cabin. My cabin. I ran to it. My father was outside looking around, looking for me. I ran up to him crying and told him Patrick wasn't a good guy and that he was really weird and was touching my legs and stuff. My father immediately called the person he rented the cabin from, and he had said that nobody had rented the cabin. My father looked at me and told me to never follow any stranger ever again. We immediately left that day, and asked for a refund for the next day. The guy renting them out apologized. The man having the cabin rentals called the police, and the police went back there and checked the cabin, and there was nobody back there, not even his wife. His clothes and belongings were still there, is what they told us. Nothing really happened after that. They asked questions and left. They never called us or told us anything about him ever again. Patrick most likely wasn't his real name, and he probably wasn't a veteran. I just want to know what happened to him and his wife, and how he even got a wife in the first place, and how and why he lived back in that cabin. He seemed to have lived there for a while. I guess he left because he figured the police would be coming after him because he didn't rent the cabin. So many questions that will never get answered. I'm just glad that it's all over, and I hope I never have to see the cabin man again.